straight that we're here, there was a Roman house on the down below on the ground floor. I've even seen it marked out on the floor. And of course we've got all sorts of Roman remains in Canterbury. Tell us a place where you really felt Rome.
Well, my favourite holiday snap shows my wife and my two daughters, who at the time were very young, standing, looking very, very bedraggled, very depressed, in Byker, in Newcastle.
Wow.
And I denied them the chance to go on holiday to Greece or Italy or somewhere sunny, on the assumption that they would absolutely be thrilled to walk the whole of Hadrian's Wall. And they were a bit dubious about this. And then we set out from Wallsend into Newcastle, and there is nothing of Hadrian's Wall to see at all. And then it started raining, and they're standing there looking like miserable little hobbits. And every time I look at it, I laugh. But I was absolutely buoyed. I was fizzing with the joy of classical scholarship, because ahead of me I knew was a kind of a key site in Roman Britain, but also in the history of the empire, which is the place where in the Middle Ages the new castle was built by the banks of the Tyne, that of course gave the name to Newcastle. But back in Roman times, in 122, was where the Emperor Hadrian had turned up. So the second emperor to come to Britain after Claudius, of course, who had launched the invasion. And Hadrian had come there to offer sacrifice to the ocean in which Britain was set, and to the god of the Tyne. And the reason that he was offering up sacrifices to this Geordie god was because he had decided to build his great wall there. But not just a wall, he gave his name to a fort and to a bridge, and the bridge was called Pons Aelius. Aelius was Hadrian's family name, so the Bridge of Hadrian. And the thing that's fascinating about this bridge that was built presumably on Hadrian's personal orders, he would have laid the foundation stone or whatever, is that there is also a bridge called the Pons Aelius in Rome, and it still stands there. And it's the bridge that leads over to the great mausoleum that Hadrian built, that in due course in the Middle Ages would be fortified and become the Castel Sant'Angelo, so dominating the approaches to the Vatican. And so far as we, and that also is, the Pons Aelius, Hadrian's bridge, so far as we know, that bridge over the Tyne was the only bridge outside Rome to be named after an emperor. And so that then opens the intriguing question, why did Hadrian give it his name? And I think the answer is that it reflects the way in which the wall that Hadrian builds is not a defensive structure. So it's not to keep out Picts or Scots or wildlings or any of that Game of Thrones stuff, which of course was directly inspired by George R.R. Martin going to Hadrian's Wall. But Hadrian built that wall as a massive statement of Roman power. It's built as a gesture of contempt towards those people beyond Hadrian's Wall, whom Hadrian has decided are not worthy of being incorporated within the great garden of the world that is the Roman Empire. Beyond the wall lies midges and iron brew and deep fried pizza and all kinds of monstrosities. Utter barbarism. So that wall, that bridge, it's a statement of power, and I think that's why Hadrian is giving his name to it. It's an absolute expression of the might that Rome commands. So Hadrian's Wall is kind of like the gates of, the kind of the estate of a tech billionaire or something. It's saying to people, you are not worthy of admittance. But it's also, I think the reason why Hadrian gives his name to it is that he, of all emperors, he is familiar with the vastness of the Roman world. From the Tyne, he will go southwards almost to the limits of the Sahara, where he will address a legion in a base, and the record of his speech has survived. And he praises the legions as people who are guarding this garden of the world. But Hadrian also, he was born in Spain. He goes all the way to Palmyra in the furthest most east, out in the desert. beyond Syria. So he understands how vast the world is, and he also understands how many different peoples there are within the limits of the empire. And again, I think that he is very modestly identifying himself as someone who can provide a focus for a sense of kind of commonality across the empire. So, you have the bridge in Rome, you have the bridge in the Tyne. It's saying that all of this is Roman. Beyond it, nothing but dankness and barbarism. And so all these thoughts were going through my head as I chivied my daughters along and told them to snap out of it and start enjoying their holiday.
I haven't said, by the way, that the book can very much be read alone, which is fortunate because we've forgotten to get one of the trilogy in, but the other one's there. And it makes, as you'll know, it makes Succession look like the Archers, really.
Well, do you know, I was the Julia Claudian advisor on Succession. So I went in to speak. So people haven't seen Succession, it's the drama series about based on the Murdochs loosely. And I was invited in by the lead writer Jesse Armstrong before they started writing it to talk to them about the family of Augustus. And so I talked to them in particular. The thing they particularly enjoyed was the story of Nero lamenting his dead wife and sending out agents across the world to try and find someone who would look like her so that he could take the simulacrum of his dead beloved to bed. And they find someone, but it's not a girl, it's a young boy, and they castrate him and turn him into the living image of Nero's dead wife. And Nero treats this poor boy as his wife from that point on. And Nero called this boy Sporus, which in Greek is spunk. So it was a kind of grim Neronian joke about the fact that this poor boy didn't have any after the operation. And this featured regularly throughout Succession. So Tom Wambsgans is always calling cousin Greg Sporus throughout.
There's so much emperors wandering around with effeminate boys, and Sporus is the extreme version. And yet there was a cult of masculinity, and they respected Sparta greatly, didn't there? Wasn't that?
Yeah. Well, it's not in any way a paradox. So the Roman word for man is vir, and the quality of a man is virtus, which we very weakly translate as virtue. But the virtus is the proper quality of a man, and this is seen by the Romans, certainly the Roman men, as explaining how and why they've been able to conquer the empire that they have done. And the converse of that, of course, in the opinion of the Romans, is that to not be a Roman, to be a slave, is effeminate. And so the association of servitude with effeminacy is very, very strong in the Roman imagination, and it becomes eroticized, which is why they have a whole class of slave delicati, kind of pretty boys, who are basically kind of made to look as feminine as possible. And yes, of course, Nero, as he always does, pushes things to extremes, always goes too far, but it is a kind of common thing. And actually Hadrian, who in so many ways has points of resemblance to Nero. He's like a kind of Nero, only not punk, perhaps put it like that. Hadrian has a favourite who is famously beautiful, as Sporus was, a young Greek boy called Antinous, who in due course, Antinous dies in very, very mysterious circumstances in Egypt, so it's death on the Nile. And Hadrian raises him up to the heavens, and he becomes a great focus of devotion across the Eastern Mediterranean, I think because he is the first person of Greek extraction to be raised to the heavens, so that when people certainly in the eastern half of the empire, Greek speakers, look at the statues of this exquisitely beautiful young man, they kind of see themselves there. So it's slight, something of the appeal of Christianity, and it's telling that the church fathers, they hate, of course, they hate all the pagan gods, but they really hate the cult of Antinous.
Christianity gets about, I think, one mention in the main text. So
It's got one paragraph, yeah.
Sort of minor.
that's nothing vindictive. I mean, talk about it as a minor, one of many sects.
Well, my previous book, Dominion, was all about Christianity. I mean, there was nothing except Christianity in for about 500 pages, so I feel like Christianed out. But the argument of Dominion was that Christianity is the most transformative and revolutionary and enduring consequence of the Roman world, and it transforms it so utterly that, to an extent, we are, even if we're not churchgoers or even culturally Christian, we still are so informed by it. It's kind of the air that we breathe. We just have no kind of real awareness of that. We take things that are very culturally contingent for granted. We kind of equate them to human nature. But the converse of that is, of course, that the world before Christianity is actually unbelievably alien. And because we tend to view it through Christian lenses, that can be obscured for us. It's like wearing kind of Christian-tinged contact lenses. So my ambition in PAX was to absolutely take the Romans on their own terms and to portray them in all their kind of assumptions and morals that to us so often can seem terrifying. And I've touched on the attitudes to slavery and to effeminacy, but there are many other ways, I think, in which the Romans are unbelievably disturbing to us. But once you start kind of buying into their worldview, then you can kind of, I hope by the end of the book, I mean, even if you're not reconciled to how the Romans see the world, you have a sense of why they see the world that they do. And so that's why in this book, although, the Christians are basically like little mammals scurrying through a Mesozoic ecosystem. They will inherit the earth in due course, but in PAX, the focus is very much on the dinosaurs. In all their ferocity and terror and glamour.
God. Another theme is that all these 5 or 6 emperors will kowtow before prophecy and supernatural and myth, won't they?
Of course.
Did you grasp that difference between these people who've invented so much and did straight roads and...
There's no contrast. Again, I mean, this is, I think, a very kind of... it's a very Protestant view that, you have to bleed the world of superstition. I mean, I think the assumption... I mean, this is why we are the heirs of Christianity, because Christianity, going right the way, even before Christianity, back to the Hebrew prophets, there's this idea that you have to drain springs and hills and things of gods and spirits, that properly there is only the one God. And of course now we've reached the Richard Dawkins stage of Christianity, there's no God at all. But the Romans take for granted that the supernatural is all around them. And again, I think that we don't understand the Roman world if we do not have a sense that the divine is everywhere around them and motivating them. And they would take absolutely for granted that everything that happens on the face of the earth is in some way connected to the dimension of the divine.
One other thing that you really myth bust is, or change the interpretation of most of us in this room would think about, is Judea. Can you talk about what Judea was?
Yeah. So
almost un-Jewish.
Yeah. So if Christianity is one, obviously massive consequence of the Roman world, so also is what I think today we would call Judaism. But again, there's a real problem in kind of back projecting modern understandings of what we would call Judaism today, which is a Christian category, by the way. It's not a Jewish category until the 19th century. Of exporting that back to the Roman world. And also I think there is a risk of calling the people who live in Judea and who in the reign of Nero rebel against Roman rule, Jews, because Jew in English carries a lot of baggage. We have lots of associations. There are Jews in the world today, and we associate them with synagogues and members of something called Judaism. This is not at all how they exist in the Roman world. They are the people of a place called Judea, and so I think it is better to call them Judeans, because if you call them Jews, it makes them seem stranger than they were to the Romans. So it's a very kind of common sense that, of course, the Jews were going to rebel against the Romans. The Jews only worshipped the one God and the Romans worshipped the many gods, and it's kind of cast as a religious war. But that's not at all what happens. Of course, the Romans see the Judeans as weird, but the Romans see everyone as weird. So the Judeans worship their one God, but they don't kind of castrate themselves and dress up as women like the Syrians are prone to doing, or they don't worship gods with the heads of animals as the Egyptians do. They don't sacrifice people in bogs and oaken glades as the Britons do. Basically, everyone is odd except for the Romans themselves. And the proof that the Romans are the only people who properly understand the dimension of the supernatural is that the gods have given the Romans the rule of the world. So there's nothing inevitable in the practice, in the cult that the Judeans have, that means they're going to rebel. They have lived very contentedly under Roman rule for many centuries. Before that, they lived under Greek rule. Of course, they had a rebellion against one of the Greek kings who pushed things too far. But before that, they had lived under the Persians. They are very habituated to living under the rule of monotheistic imperial powers. What pushes them is a succession of accidents, chief of which is the fact that Rome has burned down in the reign of Nero, and Nero wants to rebuild it on a very Neronian scale, which requires money. So he sends out particularly grasping tax collectors, and it's this that precipitates an uprising in Jerusalem. And the governor in Syria comes down with his legions to kind of crush this. One of his legions gets ambushed and wiped out, and this is the kind of the fatal step, because this is like running over one of Tony Soprano's henchmen or something. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing to do, and it makes the crushing of the rebellion inevitable. And so Nero sends out his ablest general, a man called Vespasian, who goes out there and very, very effectively and brutally crushes the Judean revolt. Nero, meanwhile, has committed suicide. A succession of short-lived emperors rise to power in the year AD 69, the year of the four emperors, and we've all just lived through the year of the three prime ministers, so we know that this is not good news. But Vespasian is the ablest of these four emperors, and he's the one who is left standing at the end of the year, makes himself emperor, heads off to run the empire, leaves his son Titus to finish off the job, which Titus does in AD 70 by capturing and destroying Jerusalem, including the temple. And the destruction of the temple is obviously a key moment in global history, because it means that the cultic center of the Judean metropolis, I should say, is gone. The Judeans have lost their metropolis, they've lost their cult center. And the expectation now, the same thing had happened to the Carthaginians when the Romans wiped out Carthage. The expectation is that without a metropolis and without a cult center, the Judeans will cease to be a people. Except, of course, they don't, because then they really do become something unusual and distinctive. They become a people. In due course, they will rebel against Hadrian, and Judea itself will be wiped from the map. It's Hadrian who renames Judea Palestina, Palestine, as an indication of the fact that the Judeans have forfeited the right to have any link to their own soil, their own land. And this, of course, will massively momentous. But in the period covered by this book, which is bookended by these two revolts, the rebellion against Nero, the rebellion against Hadrian, the Judeans are in the process of becoming what we might call Jews. But I think they're not yet Jews in this period.
Can you talk about Vespasian? What did someone say? From a warrior line nourished on Sabine berries,
Yes.
Would you agree with your quote from Tacitus that he was the only one who came out of his office better, as it were, changed for the better by the office?
Well, so this nourished on Sabine berries. The Sabines were a kind of primitive people who lived up in the hills north of Rome, and it was a desperate attempt to try and flatter him, because basically he came from peasant stock. He had no aristocratic lineage at all. He comes emperor simply because he is a military autocrat. And yet he is, yes, a very, very effective emperor. And he makes, rather than pretend to be something that he isn't, he makes great play with the fact that he's kind of a rough and ready guy. So it was said of Vespasian that he had the face of someone who was really straining to have a shit. And if I had PowerPoint, I could maybe show you that this is absolutely true, and it is funny. I mean, it's kind of pretty amazing that a joke can still be funny 2,000 years after it was cracked. But Vespasian, when he was told this, he found it funny, and I think that's one of the measures of the man, that he is, people always say about prime ministers or presidents, would you want to go for a drink with them? I think people felt that Vespasian would be fun to go and have a drink with, which isn't to say that he's not a terrifying figure, because these portrait busts that show him kind of straining on the toilet, at the same time they're also showing him as a craggy vir militaris, a military man, a great conqueror, and that really is what Vespasian is all about. He's casting himself as a military man of the kind that used to exist back in the heroic early days of Rome. So Vespasian had commanded a legion in Britain, so he was part of the expedition that landed here, and this is why he ends up in command of the armies in Judea. And he and Titus, between them, are brilliantly effective administrators, but they're also brilliant at spin. So they cast their defeat of Judea not as a suppression of a revolt, but as a conquest of a virgin territory. And the key to this is that it enables them to celebrate a triumph, which is this kind of great military procession through the streets of Rome. You don't get that for suppressing a revolt. You do get it for conquering new territory. I mean, it's a complete lie, but everyone goes along with it because they want to cheer. And Vespasian and Titus pretend that they have reaped this enormous fortune from Judea, which they haven't, because Judea, relatively speaking, is not that wealthy. Instead, what they've done is extort vast amounts of cash from the provincials across the eastern half of the Mediterranean, which means that when they come back, they can basically splash cash on a war-weary people. So they can repair temples that have been burnt down. They can build temples to peace, and above all, they can start work on the most celebrated of all Roman structures, which of course is the Colosseum, and is built on the site of this great pleasure palace that Nero had built. And it's a statement in stone that the good times are back, but also the moral times are back, because Nero's house is cast as the expression of a kind of lunatic despot, whereas for Vespasian and Titus, the Colosseum is a kind of an embodiment of stone of Roman morality. To us, of course, it seems a monument to horror, to violence, to staged, executions and people being ripped to pieces by lions and gladiators fighting. But for the Romans, this is a display of morality. People who deserve to be killed are being killed in the arena, and the Roman people are ordered as a people properly should, in ranks right the way up to the very top of the seating area. And the Romans always had this thing called a census, from which we get our concept of a census. But their census wasn't just about counting people, it was about working out where they stood morally relative to everyone else. So the wealthier you were and the kind of the nobler you were, the higher you ranked. And both Vespasian and Titus proclaim themselves censors. They feel that it's their duty to kind of reorder the Roman world after the violence and chaos of the era of the four emperors. So there's a sense in which the Colosseum is an enormous census in stone. And again, I think this is what's so fascinating, that to us, a monument that seems so steeped in blood and horror, to the Romans is an expression of moral purpose and of the ambition of Vespasian and Titus, and in due course of Titus's younger brother Domitian, who succeeds him, to win back the favour of the gods, which has plainly been lost. Because, if the favour of the gods had not been lost, why would they have allowed the year of the four emperors to happen?
You smacks a bit of Cromwell. Can you think who you might cast as Vespasian in a film?
That's a very good question, and my mind has gone completely blank.
Bit of the Cox or Robert Downey. Had a charm.
No. I think Anthony Hopkins, perhaps. In fact, I think Anthony Hopkins has been cast as Vespasian in a film about the Colosseum. I may have that. I mean, I think Anthony Hopkins.
I've got to ask you about another big myth-busting thing you do, which is talking about the Roman army, and it's amazing how important that was. Can you explain why you say there was no one Roman army?
Yes, so I think that there are aspects of the Roman world. I mean, having said how strange the Romans are, there are aspects of the Roman world that that don't strike us as being as weird as they should, because we have them as well. And one of those is a standing army. So European nation states have had standing armies for several centuries. So we're kind of habituated to the idea that you have them. The ancient world, there was nothing comparable to that until Augustus transforms what had been a much more ad hoc system into what effectively is a standing army. But as you say, it's not just one army, it's a series of armies, because a legion, a legio, it originally meant a levy, and it was the levy of the Roman people. You would lay down your toga, and you would put on your red tunic, the colour of Mars, the colour of blood, and you'd go out onto the plain of Mars, and there you would be levied, enrolled into the Roman people in arms. Obviously, as the Roman Empire becomes larger and larger, and levies have to spend more and more time abroad, this becomes harder and harder to maintain, and increasingly warlords they have their own, they are raising their own levies, their own legions, and in due course it's this that tears the republican system of government that had prevailed for centuries to pieces. And the emblematic figure, of course, is Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is murdered, but not before he has named his heir as his great nephew, the man who in due course will come to take on the name of Augustus. And Augustus comes to power in the wake of even more civil wars that have been fought in the wake of Julius Caesar's death. And the Roman world is so shattered, so exhausted, so wounded by this experience that they're willing to accept his autocracy and accept that the Republic is dead. But Augustus never has any doubt that his power rests on the fact that he has he has essentially a monopoly of violence, because he's defeated all his enemies. He is now the only person at the head of legions. You've got the question of what to do with them. So he demobs quite a lot of them. He gives land to lots of the soldiers, but lots of them he posts to the frontiers, and he arranges things that all the places where the legions are stationed are to be seen as a single province, with him in charge of them. So he is the man who alone in Rome has command of all these different armies, and the people who go out and command them in the field are simply his deputies, his legati, his legates. And it's this that underpins the power of the emperor. And our word emperor comes from the Latin word imperator, which originally meant a general who has been successful. And that is what the emperors are. They are military figures at the head of all these various armies. Now, from Augustus's heir Tiberius had been a very successful general, but from that point on, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. These are not really military men, even though they both Caligula and Claudius have affectations to be military. Nero has no interest in it at all. I mean, he has no military experience whatsoever. But Vespasian, yeah, the grand chaps of ancient world. But Vespasian, of course, I mean, he can cast himself as doubly an imperator because he's emperor, but he's also clearly, a triumphant general. And so this is the basis of his power. This is why he's so popular. He's a kind of throwback, and he capitalizes on it massively. But it is odd that the Romans do have this standing army. No one had ever had anything like that before. And it's that essentially enables the Pax Romana to endure. Pax, we translate as peace, but it might as readily be translated as pacification. And, you cannot have peace, the Romans recognize, without arms, without armies. And all the, which isn't to downplay the stunning achievement of the Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire, in maintaining peace over as broad a swathe of territory as they do and for as long as they do. I mean, it is a stunning achievement. It's the first and only time that a unitary power governs the whole of the seaboard of the Mediterranean. Mare Nostrum, our sea, the Romans call it. Incredible, and of course far beyond the Mediterranean as well. And the consequence of this is that because it's a unitary power, because people can invest and assume that conditions of peace will prevail, that ships can sail the seas and not be attacked by pirates, that they won't be attacked by kind of enemy powers, that a single system of law will prevail across the entire Mediterranean and the world beyond. Effectively, this is a single market. And the corollary of being within a single market is increasingly that different areas of the empire can specialize in what they're good at. And this in turn generates increasing wealth, which in turn can be invested, and so it goes on. And there's been an absolute sea change in attitudes to how academic assumptions about how wealthy the Roman world in this period was. It used to be thought that it was absolutely a subsistent society in which people were never far from kind of starvation. I think the opinion on that has now really changed, and so there's one leading economist who I quote in the book, who says that the Roman world in this period was richer than anywhere, any period up until the Netherlands and England in the 17th century. So the kind of the takeoff of modern capitalism, and I think the evidence for that is in the stupefying monuments that any tourist to the Mediterranean will be familiar with. The Colosseum being a kind of prime example, Pompeii, Ephesus. These massive kind of infrastructure, urban infrastructure, is dependent on the wealth that is being generated by this piece. But that piece in turn, to go back to your question, which you asked me about 30 minutes ago, is predicated on military power.
And the Praetorian Guard, rather than being this inner sort of great asset, they seem to be quite a threat. You said there was wasn't it
yes.
Nerva, the emperor, who was vomiting because they were approaching in fear?
Well, who guards the guards? Juvenal, the great satirist, asks. Yeah, so the Praetorians are a problem, but they're particularly, and it's the fact that the Praetorians give up on Nero that persuades Nero to commit suicide. But Vespasian's forces pretty much wipe them out.
What was their special status? Were they like SAS or privileged?
No, because they were. They become pretty soft because they're in the capital. So a detachment of the Praetorians after Nero's suicide goes out to meet Galba, who is a kind of hard-boiled, old-fashioned, cold-showered, turnip-eating enthusiast who thinks that the Romans are way too soft and that they all need to man up. And he despises the Praetorians, and he'll make them kind of go for brisk 30-mile hikes up the Pyrenees and over the Alps, and all the Praetorians are kind of sweating and moaning and getting blisters. So no, the Praetorians aren't really. I mean, you need them there, but So Vespasian, for instance, I mean, he appoints Titus to the command of the Praetorians. Up to that point, no. So you have senators who are, you know, the absolute creme de la creme, but emperors from the time of Augustus onwards recognise that there are two positions that are so sensitive that you cannot allow a senator anywhere near them. Command of the Praetorians is one of them. Prefect of Egypt, which is the great kind of breadbasket of the Roman world, and which you need to feed the Roman people within the capital, is the other. That these have to be given to people who aren't senators. So Titus is the first senator to become commander of the Praetorians, and it kind of seems to have broken them to the command of the emperors. After the era of the four emperors, no one really has trouble with the Praetorians.
Before we throw it open then, I've got to ask you, these emperors are also vividly portrayed in here. If you had to go on a 2-week self-catering cottage holiday with one, which emperor would you choose?
Well, maybe Vespasian. I mean, he's, I think, the funniest. But you know, I don't know, I mean, probably Hadrian, I think. I think Hadrian would be the most interesting. I think Vespasian would be the most fun, and I use the word relatively. But I think Hadrian would be the most interesting. He's the most intelligent, sophisticated, intriguing, I think, of all the emperors. So probably Hadrian.
Do you ever wonder why the hell they bothered to come all the way to this rainy, barbaric country? Did they have to? Was it an economic?
Because it was there. It was there. It was worth conquering. You know, it's agriculturally rich. It's got lots of mines. So it was worth conquering. They just got, you know, and then they just kind of reached Newcastle, and they thought, oh God, not going any further. I mean, that's, you know, the Roman Empire reaches its natural limits. That's what Hadrian's Wall represents. That's what Hadrian was all about. You know, that Hadrian basically feels, and I think, or you know, all the Romans feel, that it's just not worth bothering with these awful people in their bogs and forests, or, you know, if you're looking at the south, you know, in their desert sands. I mean, why bother? They're not worth it. I think that the Romans, I mean, they see themselves, you know, as I said, as the owners of a great and beautiful estate with spreading gardens, fountains, gorgeous artworks, wonderful cookery. I mean, everything that makes life worth living. And beyond the limits of that estate, that's where the beggars live. So why would you want to let the beggars in? So it's like, you know, the parable of Dives, the rich man, and Lazarus in the Gospels that Jesus says. The Romans are Dives, they're the rich man, and the barbarians are Lazarus. Except that in the Roman imagination, there's none of this nonsense about, you know, Dives going to hell and Lazarus going to heaven. Lazarus is a loser, and who cares about losers? That's what Hadrian's Wall is saying. That's what everything in the Roman world is about. We are the winners. You are the losers.
Fascinating.
So I end the book, as a spoiler alert, I end the book with my favourite piece, I think, of ancient graffiti, which is a guy who goes off to a Jordanian quarry. We don't know whether he is a Roman or whether he's someone who's opposed to Roman rule, but he writes, "The Romans always win." And in this period, the Romans do always win.
Time for a few questions. If anyone's got any questions, just have to speak up.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
a wall question, if I may. In the context of what you said about Hadrian's Wall, where does the Antonine Wall fit?
Well, so Hadrian is succeeded by Antoninus Pius, who he has adopted and kind of picked out as the ablest man to succeed him. And Hadrian is a vir militaris. He's a military man. That's why he wears a beard. A beard is what legionaries wear. So he's kind of making a statement. He's endlessly touring military institutions. He would never expect his soldiers to do something that he himself would not be willing to do. So he is very, very highly respected by the legions across the empire. Antoninus Pius is not a military man. And basically, the reason why I finish with Hadrian rather than with Antoninus Pius is that nothing happens. I mean, literally nothing happens. And the one thing that for which Antoninus Pius is remembered is that he does build this wall kind of from the Firth of Forth to the Clyde. So a kind of narrower gap than the Wall's End to Bowness and Solway. And I think he does this kind of as a way to be an imperator, to be a general, to kind of say, well, I'm better than Hadrian. I think that's the only reason, really.
There's
One-upmanship.
Man at the back there.
Hi. How far would you say the Romans went to convert the conquered? We know from, let's say, imperialism, post-Christianity, that conversion was a huge part. Was that the same for the Romans, or was it completely different?
It varies and changes over the course of the history of the empire. So the Romans definitely feel that they are the favourites of the gods. Why else would they have their empire? And so they definitely feel superior to other peoples, even Greeks, to whom they have a certain cultural cringe. But basically, the Romans feel that they're the best. However, having said that, they are famous and seen as unusual, particularly by Greeks, as a people who are very, very generous with their citizenship. So the Greek cities, Sparta is the classic example, are very jealous of their citizenship. They don't like foreigners, and they certainly don't let foreigners become citizens. The Romans completely different. So the myth that is told of the foundation of Rome, that Romulus, the founder of the city, who gives Rome his name, that he sets up a space that he calls the Asylum on the top of the Capitol, which is the holiest of the 7 hills in Rome. And he says that anyone can come here and claim citizenship, whether you're escaped slaves or criminals or whatever. And whether that story is true or not, and it almost certainly isn't, because probably Romulus didn't exist. Nevertheless, the fact that it exists, the story exists, is incredibly telling, because it's expressive of an attitude that if people want to become Roman, then sure, why not? Let them. And the consequence of that is that when people are defeated, as long as they are kind of dutifully submissive and grateful to the Romans for being conquered and absorbed into their empire, then in due course, if they want to become citizens, they probably can. So that by the 1st century BC, the time of Julius Caesar, all of Italy has become Roman. When Caesar crosses the Rubicon, that's a river that you're moving into Roman territory when you go across the Rubicon into, you're invading what is Roman territory. And by the time of, say, Claudius, who invades Britain, he is introducing the Gallic aristocracy as senators. They're not just citizens, but they're becoming senators. And by the time of Hadrian, you have people whose native language is Greek becoming not just senators, but consuls. And the Romans, they grumble. There are conservatives who kind of Nigel Farage away and moan about it and say, these people, they're wearing trousers and they're awful. And, Juvenal, the great satirist, he hates foreigners. He hates Greeks, he hates Syrians, he hates a lot of them, grumbling away. But it doesn't really alter the trend, which is for people across the empire increasingly to not just to identify as Roman, but to be admitted into the ranks of the Romani, of the Roman people. And the long-term corollary of that is that, by the early 3rd century, every free male is given Roman citizenship. And in a way, Hadrian is the perfect embodiment of the paradoxes of that, because I said that the beard he wears, he's the first Roman emperor to wear a beard. He wears it because that's what legionaries wear, and that's true. But he is also, I think, wearing it because that is the marker of a Greek philosopher. And Hadrian was notorious for his enthusiasm for Greek culture. He was called the Graeculus as a boy, the little Greek. And Hadrian, he kind of fosters a Hellenic equivalent of the European Union, an attempt to kind of join all these ancient city-states that have always hated each other in a kind of common union. He is absolutely unapologetic about his enthusiasm for Greek culture. He spends a lot of time in Athens. And Antinous, this beautiful boy, is for Hadrian, I think, precious to him, not just because he's beautiful, but because he's Greek. And that's another aspect of why why people across particularly the eastern half of the empire have become so devoted to Antinous as a god, is that they see themselves reflected in it. So with Hadrian, you can see, a future in which, in the long run, the capital of the Roman world will be in a Greek-speaking city, Byzantium.
There's a gentleman back there.
And the lady there.
Oh, the lady.
Were women respected, or were they just treated like chattels by the Romans?
Depends what kind of woman you're talking
The
about.
question was just whether women were respected or treated as chattels.
So if you are, if you're the mother, the wife, the sister, the daughter of a Roman citizen, then you share in his dignity. And for another citizen to sexually assault you, that would be called what the Romans called stuprum. It would be a terrible sexual crime. So you share in the dignity of your male relatives. You are the head of the familia that is always a man, pater familias. Indeed, legally speaking, he has powers of life and death over everyone in his familia, including the women. However, if you are a woman who is not of citizen status, so say you're a slave in a familia, then you are not treated with any respect at all. There is no respect for you. You are there to, if needs be, serve your master's sexual needs any way that he wants to. So the Romans have the same word for urinate and ejaculate. And there's a sense in which, a woman's orifices are like a urinal. They are there to be receptacles of the master's bodily excretions. However, do not think the Romans are sexist. Well, they are sexist, but don't think they're merely sexist, because it's just as bad for the men. Just as bad for the men. So this is why I said earlier that slaves are viewed as being by nature effeminate. And that's because they are as likely to be raped as women. And boys and girls, it doesn't matter what the age, it doesn't matter what the gender. The binary in the Roman world is not between men and women, it's between if you're a male citizen and everybody else. So it's, I said by our lights, it's a very brutal world. And that I think is a kind of absolutely shocking to our way of thinking index of Roman sexuality, license, systematic rape. And that is a kind of indication of how radical Christianity is. Because, when Paul writes to the Romans in Corinth, or indeed the capital itself, comparing the man to Christ and the woman to the church. We may say that's a bit sexist, but what Paul is saying is that to the head of the family, you can't just go around kind of raping the chambermaids and the page boys, because that's not what Jesus would do at all. You know, a kind of a loving monogamy, lifetime monogamy, is the only way that you can adequately kind of pattern yourself on Jesus' love of the church. And that is such a kind of radical and transformative idea that it takes centuries and centuries for this, by our way of thinking, much more brutal understanding of sexuality and gender relations to be transfigured. But we think they're brutal because we've been Christianized.
One more
Gentleman at the back. Gentleman at the back was, I think.
Sorry, there are so many theories, but why do you think Rome fell?
Oh goodness.
What do you think is the answer to that question?
I think the question is not so much why did it fall, but why did it take so long to fall? It's a pre-industrial society, and of course people compare it to China. China still, you know, it's obviously been conquered by barbarians many times, and it's been reconstituted and so on. But China is still recognisably the heir of the ancient empire of China that existed at the same time as the Roman Empire. But obviously we do not live in an entity that sees itself as being Roman. We do not have well, we do have a Romania in Europe, of course, but not in kind of covering the entirety of where the Roman Empire was. And I think that reflects one thing more than anything else, which is the difference in geography between China and the Roman Empire. Because the Mediterranean, if you rule the whole of the Mediterranean, then it becomes an agency of keeping the empire together. But if you lose chunks of the seaboard, then it becomes a barrier. And what makes that more menacing is the fact that there are other natural barriers across the limits of the empire. The Alps, the Pyrenees, the Channel, and the great fracture point that shows how the Mediterranean can divide as well as unite the Roman world is that the Adriatic again and again becomes a kind of fracture point. So it becomes a fracture point in the war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Becomes a fracture point in the war between Mark Antony and the future Augustus. It becomes a fracture point in the era of the four emperors. It becomes a fracture point, of course, in due course, when the empire is divided and the western half permanently disintegrates. And again, this sense that the empire might fall to pieces, that the sinews joining the various constituent parts might be cut, is a menace. And again, you have incredibly able figures who knit the sinews back together again, get the limbs functioning as one. But what happens in the 5th century is that the process of disintegration goes so far that it can't be knitted back together again. And even then, of course, you know, the eastern half does endure, for 1,000 years and more after the collapse of the empire in the east. So. Well done, the Romans, I think.
Is there one last tiny question? There's such good questions. One last one.
I was wondering, until you mentioned the Greeks, I was wondering if you could say, what did the Romans model their citizenship, their status, their aims on?
They're in customs. So they called it the Mos Maiorum, the customs of their ancestors. And
did it start small in Rome, or did it?
Well, they have a sense of citizenship right from the beginning, and it's the bonds of citizenship that, under the Republic, are the animating factor in what makes Rome Roman.
So they didn't take the model from Greece. They created their own.
They're influenced in due course by Greece, but the Romans are Roman. This is why they've been able to conquer everyone. You know, they're absolutely not Greek. They admire and quite respect the Greeks. But their attitude to the Greeks is slightly akin to, I don't know, a very successful American billionaire's attitude to Europe, I guess. Yeah, it's quite nice to go and see it, quite nice wine, quite enjoy going to see, I don't know, a play on the West End or something, but ultimately they're losers.
Well, we must wind up. We're lucky to have had Tom. Did you really say that the podcast you do is having 10 million downloads a month?
Might have done.
And also, almost unbelievably, you are playing the Apollo Hammersmith.
Yes.
We're lucky that it came all the way down to Canterbury. It's a fantastic book. It's £5 off with lots of colour photos. Thank you for all coming and for your questions. And Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you.